member of a as a member of a region, chapter, and interest group, what do you believe are the differences between the role of a regional board or committee member and the role of the chapter president or an interest group chair? We'll begin with Abigail. Abigail?
Yeah, would you be able to repeat that question one more time? I tend to take notes while I listen to questions. Okay. Sorry about that.
No problem. So as a member of the region, chapter, and interest group, what do you believe are the differences between the role of a regional board or a committee member and the role of the chapter president or an interest group chair? So every candidate has 2 minutes to respond to the question, and Siobhan will announce when there are 30 seconds left to speak. Do you want to go, Abigail, or do you want me? Yeah. Are you good with the question?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, so I think I will have to pass on this one.
Okay. Kathryn?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, like I would say that my opinion between the differences between the two roles would be really related to sort of like the scope of influence, and in terms of like understanding exactly like what factors you need to take into consideration. Like if you're sitting sort of like on a regional kind of like committee, or you're acting in that capacity, you have to think beyond kind of like just the scope of your specific interest group or your specific chapter. You have to think about how that issue needs to be considered across a whole geographic region and what the different sort of like nuances of that would be, as opposed to like when you're sitting kind of like within a specific chapter, you have specific interests of that like membership group. And I think it's finding the balance.
Okay, thank you, Kathryn. Edward, would you like to go?
Sure. My understanding of the role of regional rep or an interest group rep to the board in relation or how it is different from my previous role, for example, as an interest group chair, I guess is in terms of the depth and the scope of the interest group representative to the board role, in the sense that it is the interest group representative to the board has a broader scope, in the sense that it is directly involved in the management of the affairs of the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario, working alongside other members of the board of directors, the president, and the CEO. Whereas as an interest group chair, my scope was more limited to the vision, mission, and objectives of the interest group in relation to RNAO's vision and mission. And then now I go beyond that and consider the much broader vision, mission, and objectives and values of our organization, in addition to what Katie had already said as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Claudette?
In here. Thank you, President-elect Nurse Practitioner Lamo. We're moving on to the next question. RNAO promotes diversity and individual worth amongst its RN, NP, and nursing student membership. With the increase of racism, discrimination, and violence, how will you support RNAO in addressing anti-Black, anti-Asian, anti-Indigenous racism and discrimination against gender, sexual orientation, and religion in Ontario? And we start with Kathryn.
So I would say that like my journey in terms of like learning about equity, diversity, and inclusion is probably, as I said, like a journey. It's something that's ever evolving. I think that for me, at least, that one of the most important things to start off with is by being self-reflective in terms of like how I approach a role, how I approach kind of like people within the role, and being aware of like any biases that I potentially hold. Because I think first and foremost, like if you're unaware of kind of like where your biases are or where your opportunities for learning are, then I don't think that you can move forward within that journey of being actually an active sort of like advocate and supporter of equity, diversity, and inclusion issues. So I think that within kind of, if I was successful in obtaining a role within the RNAO, it would be being a part of like setting that standard in terms of encouraging everyone that I work with to be able to think like critically about like the actions and decisions that we're making on behalf of our membership groups.
Thank you, Kathryn. Edward?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. I would start by saying that self-reflection is key to be able to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as decolonization at a time and place in our society where racism, discrimination, and violence are just so prevalent. And the way that I would address this is by speaking out and calling out people when I see these unfortunate incidents happen. As well, part of my work related to doing research with internationally educated nurses is to uncover the issues and challenges and barriers, including discrimination, racism, microaggression, and stereotyping of internationally educated nurses. And so I will seek out different fora to present my research findings as a way of um, highlighting these issues, as well as getting feedback from the community to find ways to better address these challenges, and of course working with RNAO in different capacities uh, to address these issues. In fact, I was just at the Canadian Association of Schools of Nursing this past two days, and I had the great pleasure or opportunity to be one of the keynotes where I presented my study on the employment trajectory of Philippine educated nurses in Ontario, and it was very well received. And that during that event, I highlighted the issues of racism and discrimination that this group of nurses have experienced. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Abigail?
So thank you for this question. This is actually something that I'm personally very passionate about. And part of why I ran for this position is for my passion in this area. I think as a member of the Provincial Resolutions Committee, this is an area where speaking out is directly in line with what resolutions are for. So I think actively being involved in this role, not just keeping in mind our own biases and self-reflection and whatnot, and encouraging that in others, but this is a role where we can take action and speak about what nurses feel about certain modern day issues that are being faced, such as BIPOC issues right now. I think speaking out is probably, we can reflect all day and whatnot, but at the end of the day, as someone who identifies as Métis myself, speaking out doesn't happen as often as it should, and I feel that's where taking action is the most important thing. And oftentimes it's not just to call out a situation that has happened. Sometimes it's pulling our peers aside and saying in really uncomfortable conversations, hey, what you just took part in that was a microaggression. Like, even if you're friends with them, those can be uncomfortable conversations. And unfortunately, it can cost friendships. It can cause stress on teams, but these are necessary conversations to have in order for change to occur. So I think being able to take lead on these issues is probably lead on the action behind what needs to happen to make these changes is probably one of the most important things that we can do to further our profession and make sure that we're not just speaking about changes and not just saying this is what we value, but actually putting that into our everyday practices with our peers and our coworkers is probably the most important thing, and speaking up for patients and whatnot as well. So that's something that I really, really feel passionate about, and something that I see that now. Thank you.
Thank you, Abigail. Back to our president-elect, Lamo NP.
So we'll now move on to member submitted questions. And so here it is. What would your learning goals be as a RNAO board of director or a committee member? So what would your learning goals be as a RNAO board of director or committee member? We'll begin with Abigail.
So I think for me, probably the biggest learning goal, being so new to the profession, but also new to being involved in RNAO at all, would be learning how the internal structure is set up for RNAO and how they function and how work together. Understanding the differences between certain roles and scopes, as was asked in that first question there. That would be my biggest learning goal, is understanding sort of, I guess, quote unquote, my place in the grand scheme of things, and learning what my capacity is and how far I can go with my passions in order to speak out and make changes. And the next learning goal I would strive for is to, I guess I have a lot of experience with speaking out and making public statements that represent groups of people through my committee experience in the past. I'd want to learn how to do that with a profession so big as nursing. Like across Ontario, we've got how many 40,000 nurses. I'd want to make sure that I'm not just speaking out for my own beliefs or what I think is right. I want to make sure I'm representing what the body's opinions are, taking those into account and making sure that it's an accurate representation of our profession and what we believe. So I think in my position, it's learning how to be in touch with people on the grounds, and that I would be representing them accurately.
Thank you, Abigail. Next, we'll go on to Kathryn.
So this would be kind of like my first sort of interaction with the bylaw committee. I think my learning goal number one would actually be to understand sort of what the expectations of the position would be and how to be effective within the role as a committee member. So I would imagine that would be a quite steep learning curve. I think as we sort of move into new roles, just being able to understand kind of like the basics of it is often the first sort of like step. And then after that, as you become more proficient in your role, you're able to think about like the bigger picture of how the bylaw committee sort of fits into the more macro level structure of the RNAO, and then finding ways to kind of like leverage that interaction with the committee into future opportunities with RNAO.
Thank you, Kathryn. Edward?
I think I have three things that I'm hoping to do in the next within the foreseeable future. And the first one would be to gain a better understanding of what my role entails. The second would be to understand the needs and issues of my constituencies, which would be the different interest groups. And the last one would be to explore with these interest groups how this role can best support and represent them to the board of directors. Those are my learning goals.
Okay, thank you, all of you. Next, we'll move on to Claudette, Dr. Holloway.
Thank you, President-elect Lamo. The last question is, please tell us about your past advocacy work, and we will begin with Edward.
Yes, my past, I wouldn't say it's past, it's been an ongoing advocacy work. I've always been, being an internationally educated nurse myself, I've always been passionate about internationally educated nurse issues. Even before the issue of IENs became hip and popular these past few years, I've already been doing stuff related to IENs. And so this is something that I'm very passionate about. It has drawn me to accept an appointment as a program coordinator for bridging program for IENs at the community college. I have been a member of a group, a grassroots organization formed by IEN educators called the Partners in Integration and Education of IENs since 2010. And since 2019, I have been a co-chair of this group. During my spare time, I collect used nursing textbooks and I send them over to nursing programs in the Philippines. And I've been doing this since 2010. And I believe I may have sent more than 25 huge boxes to different nursing programs. I typically choose state universities where there are limitations in terms of their resources. And so I try to engage with those state universities. With my involvement with IENs, I have been tapped to do different projects related to them. For example, I'm currently working on a book chapter for the Canadian Association of Schools of Nursing on preceptorship for IENs. I have been tapped also by the Canadian Association of Schools of Nursing to develop modules on IEN preceptorship. Yes, my time is up. Thank you. Sorry, Siobhan.
Thank you. Going on to Abigail.
So a lot of the advocacy work that I did was mostly as a student, since as a new grad, I've been focused more on catching up and keeping up with clinical work. So when I was a student involved with the Canadian Nursing Student Association, I was on the Strategic Planning Committee and the Governance Committee, which I mentioned in my intro. And part of that was restructuring the CNSA to involve more Indigenous views, involve smudging in ceremonies, involve more of a circular structure. I wish I had my visual for that I could explain. Rather than a hierarchical structure, was more of a circular structure for membership. So we viewed membership and positions on the board as more equal rather than hierarchical, as I mentioned. So we changed the internal structure there. We readjusted our goals largely following the pandemic to represent student needs. A lot of those needs focused around less so BIPOC issues for this work, but around the needs for placements, because those were all shut down during the pandemic. And I heavily advocated I worked with ONA one-on-one a lot through my position as the Ontario Regional Director to advocate for student placements, getting the hospitals opened up, getting the long-term care centers opened up so that students could come back in. And a lot of those discussions, along with others who'd advocated, it ended up leading to the government creating the clinical extern program that we're now familiar with. So I contributed to that work kind of on a larger scale as well.
Thank you. Kathryn.
So I think that when I hear the wonderful efforts that Abigail and Edward have put in, kind of Abigail through her very short career in nursing and Edward through his far more extensive one, my efforts in advocacy are incredibly underwhelming, I must confess. I think for me, advocacy has been about how I do my day-to-day role. I think as someone who currently represents the interests of 170 interprofessional staff, essentially my job is to advocate for safe conditions for them to work in, and to ensure that they have kind of the supplies and settings that they need to be able to engage in effective, safe practice, and as well working kind of within the organization at large, to ensure that I am supporting the best outcomes for patients and families. And I think for me, that is what I have been involved in kind of over my years in clinical management. And while it does not come anywhere near to the more macro level impacts of Abigail and Edward's work, I feel that I do have the aptitude to be a strong voice for the people that I represent.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. Thank you all. We will now open the floor to questions for all candidates. We will first take questions from the Q&A, and then attendees are welcome to unmute themselves to ask a question. Siobhan, are there any questions from the Q&A box? We'll deal with those first.
Currently, there are no questions. There is a comment. Well, actually, there was one question which I did answer in the chat box as well. Marianne was asking to please remind us all of the roles that each candidate is up for. So I did provide that information in the chat. And beyond that, the only other thing is a comment from Edward stating that Kathryn putting forward her name for the Provincial Bylaw Committee is advocacy work.
Thank you. So hearing that we have no Q&As from boxes, anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask a question? Any of the attendees here today?
I would like, Madam President, I would like to, number one, congratulate and thank each one of the candidates that presented. It's very courageous for people to put names forward. And I also want to comment on how beautiful that one candidate congratulates another and gives positives. I think that shows RNO in action. You all are amazing. And if there is time at the end, Madam President, if we can ask their feedback on the session, not on what people said, but actually on the session, so we can learn about that for the go forward, if you don't mind.
Thank you. So, anyone else would like to unmute and speak? I'll just give a few moments.
It's Marianne. I have my hand up, but maybe you don't see it, so I'll lower.
Oh, there it is now. Thank you.
Okay, maybe it's a lag time. Anyways, no, I just wanted to thank the candidates for letting their names stand, and because I happen to be in the past have sat on the Provincial Resolution Committee and the Bylaws Committee. They'll learn the position through the terms of reference and everything, and biggest thing for the bylaw committee would be to read the bylaws. I'm familiar with them, and just want to thank Edward again for, I guess, standing again for interest group. I've been an interest group rep on the board and found it very rewarding, but quite a task looking after all those interest groups. So again, I just want to thank all three candidates for letting their names stand and wishing you good luck.
Thank you, Marianne. I don't see any other hands up.
Okay.
Okay, so
Yeah.
back to President-elect Lamo for closing remarks.
And also
Yeah.
feedback from the candidates about the session, Madam President. Thank you.
Do you
Okay.
want to take the feedback after the closing remarks?
Well,
Okay.
let's take the feedback that Dr. Grinspan is asking for. Let's take that first, and then you go ahead with the closing remarks. So,
Sure.
candidates, please.
I guess
can
we'll
go
call.
first.
Yeah. Yes,
Edward
Edward, yeah.
has his hand up.
Yeah.
Go
I
ahead.
came in, I actually had a cheat sheet here, which because I wasn't sure what to expect, but once the questions were asked, I just put it aside and I just used the back part of it to take down some notes. And so I guess it's so nice to be able to just speak from the heart and your mind without any script. and I appreciated the questions, and I'm sure I'll be reaching out to Marianne and President-elect Lamo for help as I continue to navigate the role of interest group chair to the board of directors, and of course my dear mentor, Dr. Angela Cooper-Brathwaite.
I've had my hands up several times and it keeps disappearing. I don't know.
Sorry, Dr. Cooper-Brathwaite, please go ahead.
I have a question and I will like each of the candidates to answer my question. I would like to ask, what would be your contribution to the board? and to RNAO members.
So maybe we'll go with
You want me to start?
point of order. Yeah, Edward, since you're already.
I think I will bring to the board my voice as an internationally educated nurse, supported by evidence from my work and my research, and ongoing engagement with internationally educated nurses in different capacities. I think that will be my biggest contribution to the board, and also being able to, because of my current role as an educator, I feel that I am in an advantage position to help bring out highlight the voice of RNAO to the students that I work with and I will be working with to make our association an even stronger and representative association for nurses in our province. Thank you.
Thank you.
you,
We'll go
Edward.
to, Kathryn then maybe.
I think what I would bring to the board would be a fresh perspective. I think I come from someone who has not been involved sort of heavily in the RNAO or sort of like traditional advocacy efforts. I am someone who is currently kind of like on the ground in healthcare, working within a highly pressurized system. I feel like I'm reasonably in touch with kind of the pressures that the nursing profession has faced. And I want to bring that voice to the committee.
Yes, it will be Abigail then. Next.
I think the biggest, I'm smiling because I have a bit of a mouth, a good mouth. Like I speak out for what's right, even if it's uncomfortable. So I feel like that's it comes in handy when it comes to advocacy. It really does. So I think that's something that I bring to the table that not a lot of new grads necessarily have the guts to do. And I think being able to speak out about certain things and represent the new grads that are out there is really, really important because that is the future of nursing. And I feel like a lot of new grads have thoughts and have ideas that they're just not ready to speak up and voice and put into writing anywhere yet. And I feel like the system is taking advantage of nurses for that reason. Like we're very quiet as new grads, I find. And I think it's important that we kind of, as I think Katie was mentioning, revitalizing advocacy efforts. I don't know why new grads are so quiet. We need to speak up more because there's things that need to change. So that's something that I'm really passionate about. And I would love to bring that to the table, as well as, you know, my perspective as a Métis person is always in the background for me. And there's not a lot of Indigenous nurses out there. There's a lot of Indigenous patients, but there's not a lot of Indigenous nurses. So I feel that representation is also important because it's a perspective that is a little bit lacking. And there's a lot of wonderful, wonderful things to learn from Indigenous perspectives, a lot of peace that could be brought from learning those things. So that's what I feel like I can bring.
Yes, thank you, Abigail. And going back to the feedback, I think Edward gave his feedback. And next was, feedback. So would you want to continue with the feedback, Abigail, about the process? And then we'll go to Kathryn.
I definitely feel like I was winging it, and I had a whole cheat sheet as well because I didn't really know what to expect. And now I walked in here and I'm like, oh, okay, we're just talking. That's cool. So that's fine. I feel like the only feedback I would say is just a little bit of direction to know what to expect for today for those of us who run on the more anxious spectrum.
Thank you. Kathryn?
So I would like to ask a question just for a second, if that's okay, to Abigail. So Abigail, of course, we cannot give the questions in advance, but to tell you that there will be first questions, introduction, and that type of thing is good?
I guess the structure of what the webinar is going to look like for
very good. That's
not questions.
doable. That's doable. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm still waiting to hear from the other candidates.
Sorry, Ed.
All answered.
I see Dania Versailles is there.
Lamo will clarify for you. Lamo is chairing this piece now.
Yeah. So I think Dr. Angela, they all already commented on the contributions that they would bring to the board, coming into the position. And I think we were now getting feedbacks. Each candidate did give their contribution, and then now we're doing feedback. So Edward already gave us feedback, and so did Abigail. Now we're just going to Kathryn for the feedback for the process for the webinar today.
And my feedback would be that, like, I really appreciated that there was some scheduling flexibility. Offering to host the webinar during a lunch hour was very helpful to us that have daytime jobs. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I guess, is there anything that I'm missing, Dr. Holloway, our president?
In terms of these candidates that are present for this webinar, I believe we're all complete. We do have other webinars scheduled, so we're complete for today as per the names we have in this session.
Yes, thank you. So I guess if there are no other questions from the audience, Siobhan, do we have any more?
I would like to make another comment.
Yes.
Earlier this week, I had two colleagues who have used the healthcare system. One had a wrist broken and her cast had to be changed 4 times because it was incorrectly placed. She went at first to the ER with a wrist with the bone out, and a nurse said to her, "What are you doing here?" So she said, "I'm here because my wrist is broken." He said, "Do you want a tablet? Some until the doctor sees you." He gave her 2 tablets, and she said in the water was about 3 feet away from her, and he walked away. It took her so long to see somebody else. And this is a person who has been in administration and nurse for many years. Another nurse had surgery. After the surgery, nobody gave her instructions what she should do following the surgery. And both of them are commenting how bad the standard of care is in these hospital settings, and said, is RNAO going to help us to regain some of the standards for nurses who are practicing? And I will just make a statement that I made to the Dean of Ontario Tech about 5 years ago. I was teaching 2nd-year students maternity, and they were so terrible in their behavior, lack of respect, compassion. I said to her at the end of the semester, not everybody should be in nursing. Some of the students who were in my class should never be nurses. I said to her, grades are not enough for people
Dr.
to
Cooper.
enter this.
Yeah. Dr. Cooper
profession.
Brathwaite, is there a specific question that you want
So
to
my
ask the
comment
candidates?
is, would we RNAO be able to help some of the younger nurses improve their standard of care? And those of you who are teaching students, would you help them to improve the standard of care? Because if you're going to treat patients without compassion, you do no follow-up care, you do not tell them, teach them anything when they don't know.
So thank you, Dr. Cooper Brathwaite. Thank you, Dr. Cooper Brathwaite. Is there a specific question that you would like the 3 candidates to respond to in regards to your comments, which are well taken?
If any of them are in hospital setting or anywhere they're working and have opportunity to teach or supervise staff, I would like to know, how could you improve the standard of care in nursing where you work?
Okay. Candidates, this is coming from the floor. We're going to give you all a chance to respond to this within the 2-minute period. I believe that we have President-elect Lamo. So who would like to go first?
I can probably go first.
Thank you.
From my perspective, being in the academy, I think we make our best effort within our institution to make sure that our students meet the RN entry to practice competencies. And this is while respecting human rights in terms of students requiring accommodation because of their disabilities and other issues. But I can assure Dr. Cooper Brathwaite that at least from our institution, we uphold the CNO's entry to practice competencies and make sure that only those who meet the minimum requirements are allowed to graduate from our program. I hope that partly addressed your question.
Not quite. It's
thank you, Edward.
Partially,
thank you.
Because when I say partially,
thank you.
As
Dr.
I said, education is not enough.
Dr. Cooper Brathwaite, thank you. We're asking the candidates to respond. They have their 2-minute session. Thank you for bringing the issue forward. We've had Edward, who is going next.
I can go next.
Thank you.
I think what she's getting at is more like, as much as we have the, sorry, my dog's barking in the background. As much as we have the intentions and we follow the legislature and we meet the standards and whatnot, things do still slip through the cracks all the time. And I think it's really important that we're teaching new nurses to ask questions. And when we say to them, ask questions, don't just say, ask questions. Like, it has a vague statement and it's almost intimidating to new nurses. I think it's more like, why? Explain why you need to be asking questions, because new nurses don't know what they don't know. And so explaining that process to them and why you can stumble in, if that means using your own anecdotal mistakes that you've made in the past as a new grad to show them and teach them, this is why we're extra cautious, then do that. And if you see nurses that are, causing, I don't want to say causing problems, but ones who are lacking in their practice, even if they've met all those standards at those checkpoints beforehand, we all have bad days. Pulling a nurse aside and saying, hey, you seem a little off your game. Are you okay? Like calling out our coworkers when we see some of this behavior and some of this stuff that's being missed in a way that's kind. Because I think kindness is so undervalued these days. Like, being kind, not just to our patients, but to each other, doesn't necessarily mean we close our mouth and avert our eyes when we see things go awry, but we speak up with kindness. And that's a skill and an art to learn that I think we all should be focusing on practicing and apologizing when we get it wrong. That's how I feel.
Thank you, Abigail. Kathryn?
I mean, I wish I could say that like Dr. Cooper Brathwaite's comments were surprising, but I suppose they are not to me. I think that the experience that Dr. Cooper Brathwaite's loved ones had are probably not dissimilar to experiences that people across the province of Ontario have on a day-to-day basis. I think it's very easy to attribute those circumstances to the behavior or the level of compassion of a single practitioner, when I think that those behaviors are a manifestation of greater systemic issues within our healthcare system right now. We have created a healthcare system that has set our nurses up to fail. We put them into conditions where they do not have like the cognitive capacity or the emotional resiliency to be able to show that empathy that makes so much of a difference to the life and care of like our patients and families. I think that in order to support an environment where nurses feel that they have the bandwidth to interact with people in a thoughtful, compassionate manner that meets the standard of care, you have to overhaul the way in which we have positioned nursing within this province. Right now, we have nurses that behave in a way that is task-based and aren't thinking about the bigger picture of care. And I find it like really unfortunate, but I think this is the reality of acute care facilities across the province. And so I think that for those of us that have decided to take sort of like broader sort of roles in advocacy in terms of supporting the profession of nursing, that to me is even more important in some ways than looking at just education of individual people, because until we change the system, we are not going to see better outcomes.
Thank you, Kathryn. Executive office has their hands up, I see. No? Okay.
That was simply to alert of time, sorry.
We're out of time.
Yes, almost. Okay, so thank you. I think, are there any more questions? Because that will bring us to the closing remarks now.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, seeing none. Abigail, do you want to, am I okay to start the closing remarks, Dr. Holloway?
I'm just checking the chat. There is one question from Dania in the chat. Dania, do you want to unmute and speak to your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
So to all the candidates, if possible, whenever possible, as you will exercise your new roles with the RNAO, as you will step into your new roles with RNAO, how will you attract and encourage others to follow your lead to get involved in roles such as the ones you have put your candidacy for? So in terms of succession planning.
Who's going first? Abigail?
Yeah, I can go first. I think speaking from the perspective of newer grads, I mean, I tend to, well, I guess we all do kind of stick to similar cohorts, but I get a lot of new grads kind of following me around, and I think a lot of that is because I've managed to find a way to speak out when usually we don't. So I think encouraging them to go for positions like this, or to go and speak up to their superiors, even with work environment issues and whatnot, rather than staying quiet, is really important. And it is only intimidating when you think about doing it. Once you do it and you put yourself out there to do it, it is not so intimidating. You get comfortable with being uncomfortable, for lack of a better term. So I think having those conversations with them, and if people are coming to you and they're complaining about things, or they're concerned about things, or they're in moral distress, like talking about, okay, from a bigger perspective, what can we do to change this, instead of just venting and continuing on without trying to change any of the systemic problems. Kind of pushing people to have those conversations is a really great start.
Thank you. Edward?
Yes, I'm thinking I'll be using my experience within the International Nursing Interest Group. I will approach this through collaboration and role modeling. I've had the great pleasure of being being role modeled during my time with the International Interest Group. I was coached, I was taught, there were times when my hands were held. We had difficult conversations, and it's learning from these things that empowered me to put my name forward. And I think I'll be doing the same thing as I work with other interest groups, in the role of the interest group chair to the board of directors. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Kathryn?
I think for me, it would really be about like sharing my experiences with those that I sort of interact with within the nursing profession. I think for many people, the RNAO is really like they see the primary value as being the provider of their PLP coverage, and an organization that sends a lot of emails about some interesting topics, but again, seems kind of a sort of distant entity that doesn't really sort of interact in their day-to-day. And so I think that sharing the message from sort of a lived experience perspective about the value that interacting with the RNAO can have I think that has power.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. And that is the last question. There is one in the chat, candidates, for you that you can answer by the chat. Talks about how you will look after yourself. Please answer that in the chat. But we want to respect time, so we're going back to President-elect NP Lamo for her closing comments, and then I will have the final say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Holloway. I think it was a great session today, and we would all agree that we, we are very proud of where we are as nursing, part of the nursing profession, and working in different roles. So thank you all for putting your name forward. Having said that, we should have the closing remarks. So we'll go in the order, your last minute thoughts and what you want to pitch in. So Abigail, we'll go with you first.
I guess first off, I'll just thank you guys for opening this up, for making it possible for newer, less experienced nurses like me to be able to put their name out there. I appreciate those opportunities a lot. And I guess my closing remark is that although I am young and not as experienced as many others, I do have a lot of passion for this profession, and there's a lot of change that needs to happen that I want to be a part of and push the profession towards. So in whatever capacity I'm able to do that is what I'm available and willing to contribute. And I think that's what I bring to the table most and what I'm most looking forward to.
Thank you, Abigail. We'll go to Edward next.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to all of you this afternoon. I really hope to be able to contribute to RNAO's vision and mission in advancing our nursing profession here in Ontario forward. We are at a very critical time in our province, and I want to be able to contribute as much as I'm able to in my role in advancing the nursing agenda in our healthcare system. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. And last but not least, Kathryn.
Just first and foremost, sort of like, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to share a little bit about myself. It was lovely to sort of be on the session with Abigail and Edward. I would not say that like I am the best candidate for this role, because really like I think there are so many people who are going to be running for positions and have many strengths to bring. So I would just encourage everybody to vote who you think is going to be their best representative for you, and whether I'm elected or not, I intend to support the RNAO in some capacity. So thank you.
Thank you so much, and back to Dr. Holloway.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank you, the candidates, for participating today. And thanks to our members for their thoughtful and passionate questions. I would just like to say personally at RNAO, there is room for all. There is learning for all, and there is success for all. Together, we can do it. Please remember that one member, one vote will close, one member, one vote will close on June 20th at noon. Remember to vote and remind your nursing colleagues to vote as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.